go, here we go, here we go, here we go. Here we go, here we go. Oh shit, it shows my shit. Turn it off. Shit bright here.
Great ideas can come from anywhere. With Wix, you decide where they go. Put your ideas into play with AI and watch them shape every aspect of your website.
The main concern is that because AI enables the weapon to operate entirely without human supervision, that means that one person can push a button and launch perhaps 1 million weapons at once and wipe out an entire population.
It is certainly the most disruptive tech development of our times, and potentially, at its worst, a threat to humanity. On Monday, world leaders, tech bosses and AI experts will meet in Paris for a huge summit on the future of AI. We're joined from there by Stuart Russell, who wrote the textbook on AI and will be at the summit. Welcome to Newsnight, Professor Russell.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
Great to have you. This week, Google dropped its previous commitment not to use AI-powered weapons and surveillance systems. What's your reaction to that, first of all?
I think it's an interesting decision. The history of this is that Google participated in a defense project called Project Maven back in 2017. And that was at least ostensibly about using AI for surveillance, which sounds fairly harmless. But the employees of Google were worried that the same technology would be used in autonomous weapons, because if you can do AI for reconnaissance and recognize a target, you can also then shoot the target. And that employee revolt led Google to actually pull out of the project and then install this policy which said Google products will not be used for autonomous weapons. And so you might ask, well, why are they undoing that policy? And I'm sure that the fact that the Trump administration is now in power has something to do with it. The market for this kind of software is not going to be very big compared to Google's consumer market or its business market. So I don't think they're making this decision in order to make lots of money from autonomous weapons. I think they're making this decision to curry favor with the administration. And you might say, well, why do they need to do that? And I think the reason is that a court has found that they were running an illegal monopoly and is proposing to break them up as a remedy.
Why would it be that they would change it based on the Donald Trump administration?
Because they feel that this would be a change that would appeal to the Trump administration. They might, had a different administration been elected, they might have chosen something different as a way of currying favor. But they presumably felt that this was the kind of change they could make that would signal their support for the administration and its views.
Okay, and you're talking there about autonomous weapons systems. I guess most people, when they think about AI, they might think about its possibilities of revolutionizing the economy, or perhaps more simply a good way to cheat at homework potentially. But for you, what does keep you awake at night about AI? Is it this?
Well, so I think you make a good point. Most people right now, when they think about AI, they do think about good things like medical diagnosis, having something to play chess with. And we, the AI community, don't want the death of human beings to be the first thing that comes to mind when you think about AI. So there are at least two different threads going on with respect to the use of AI in weapons. So one is conventional weapons, and those are being discussed in Geneva amongst most of the countries in the world. And there, the main concern is that because AI enables the weapon to operate entirely without human supervision, that means that one person can push a button and launch perhaps 1 million weapons at once and wipe out an entire population. So we don't think that's a good idea, but that seems to be the direction that things are going right now. The discussions in Geneva have not made a lot of progress. There are major powers, including the US and Russia, surprisingly collaborating on preventing any discussion about banning these kinds of weapons.
But you've just given us a horrific scenario there. How likely do you think that would be?
To be honest, I think it's very likely, because what we're seeing in Ukraine in particular, which is sort of a crucible for technological advancement in these kinds of weapons, is that the weapons are becoming more and more autonomous because of electronic countermeasures. So it used to be that both sides were killing each other using remotely piloted drones, which require a radio link so that the operator can see through the camera. But then with jamming, those are possible. And so if you want your weapon to do something useful, you have to make it fully autonomous. And that's already happened.
Okay, and you wrote a paper recently that said, left unchecked, powerful AI systems may pose an existential threat to the future of humanity. Can you give us any kind of timeline on that?
So that's a separate issue, and I want to be very clear on that. The kinds of AI that are being proposed for weapons can actually be very simple. It's a lot easier to do a weapon than to do a self-driving car, for example, which Google is already doing in San Francisco. The kinds of AI that we're talking about that present an existential threat are quite simply AI systems that are far more intelligent than human beings. And there's a long record of more intelligent species, for example, us, wiping out less intelligent species, such as dodos and roughly 1 million other species that we put out of business. And so if we create systems that are far more intelligent than us, and we haven't figured out how to control them forever, then we're going to be in big trouble. And this is a view that is now pretty much a consensus among leading AI researchers in academia, among the CEOs of the companies who are building it.
And it is a worrying scenario. The other worrying scenario, of course, and it plays into all of this, is people's fears around their jobs. And I wonder, for people watching tonight who might be worried about that, do you have any sense, as a sort of expert in AI, do you have any sense of which professions you might be protected in and which professions are the ones that will go?
It's a really interesting question. It's sort of a moving target. We used to think that, the creative professions, of course, those are going to be around forever. But, with the advent of generative AI that can write an entire book in the style of James Bond in 10 seconds, that can churn out commercial quality art by the thousand, that can write music that can reach the top of the charts. Clearly, the creative professions are under threat. And we saw the Hollywood writers go on strike for a long time, basically insisting that AI not be used in writing scripts, and the actors didn't want AI systems basically impersonating them and taking their livelihoods away as a result. So it's really hard to point to any except possibly politicians, because they're the ones who write the rules, and they're not going to allow themselves to be replaced.
Okay, so we all need to be politicians, potentially, if we can. Okay, thank you so much. Very useful information there from you, and also obviously worrying. Stuart Russell, thank you very much for coming on Newsnight.
Thanks, my pleasure.
Taxes was waiting and wondering and worrying. Now Taxes is matching with a TurboTax expert who does
fresh off winning MVP at the Super Bowl, 26-year-old Eagles quarterback Jalen Hurts celebrating his massive victory at Walt Disney World today. And talking with our own Will Reeve.
At what point in the game did you allow yourself to think, I'm a Super Bowl champ?
Honestly, going into the locker room and seeing my teammates celebrating, that's when it hit. I'm just a ton of gratitude, and I'm truly blessed.
I don't know if Jalen Hurts needed any new fans, but he definitely has a bunch of new fans now.
Eagles fly in Super Bowl 59.
The Philadelphia Eagles, the newly crowned NFL champs after crushing the Kansas City Chiefs at Super Bowl 59.
I don't think many people expected this level of domination. It was honestly quite shocking to see.
Fans packing the streets of Philly last night to celebrate. It was a star-studded night. Commercials starring David Beckham and Matt Damon for Stella Artois. And Ben Affleck reprising his role as the Dunkin' for Dunkin' Donuts, along with brother Casey Affleck. And on the sidelines, a slew of celebrities also taking center stage at Caesars Superdome in New Orleans. Kendrick Lamar rapping about his ongoing dispute with singer Drake and a legal battle involving their shared record label. Performing songs including his Grammy-winning diss track, Not Like Us, in a halftime show.
Say Drake, I hear you like I'm young. You bet like him or go to Cell Block 1.
You had not decided that there was a flawless victory winner before the Super Bowl. It's decided now. And it's Kendrick Lamar.
Taylor Swift in the stands cheering on boyfriend Travis Kelce. Even President Donald Trump was there, marking the first time a sitting U.S. president has attended the game. The kickoff to football's biggest night started with an emotional tribute to the New Year's Day terrorist attack victims. Lady Gaga performing Hold My Hand. With a 40-22 win, the Eagles shut down the
Hold on. Crushing them. But I did it up. They crushing them. They crushing them. You better never go to Cell Block 1. That man mad as shit. Hey Drake.
It really does remain to be seen what tariff policies will be implemented, and I just think it would be unwise to speculate. Well, we really don't know. I mean, we see proposals, but it's so hard to say what's going to happen. And
Well, last time the Trump administration was in office, the Fed took actions because they were concerned about the impact of increasing tariffs. Isn't that the case?
we wound up cutting rates in 2000 and I guess it was 19, but it really was because growth slowed and confidence was weak and the global economy was weakening. So the net effect of all that's what we look at. It's really not just tariffs. It's tariffs, immigration, fiscal policy, and regulatory policy, and those will all go into a mix, and we'll try to make sense of it and do what's right for monetary policy.
If you could just get back to me on the question of increasing the deficit by trillions of dollars and what impact you believe that has on inflation prices. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
Senator Lummis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks, Chairman Powell, for being with us today. I think you're aware of what direction my questions will take. They will be focused on the bank supervision function of the Fed. And I point out that when you and I were toddlers, 1956, the chairman of the Fed at the time, William McChesney Martin, said that the Federal Reserve Board is an agency of the Congress. Ben Bernanke said something similar in 2013 when he told Janet Yellen that, quote, Congress is our boss. Do you agree with that statement?
Yes, the way I always say it is that our supervision, our accountability runs through the legislative branch, not through the executive branch, as it does in many other forms of government.
Thank you for that, because I wouldn't have guessed that was going to be your response. The way that the Fed has behaved for the last 4 years in its relationship with the U.S. Congress is to thumb its nose at Congress. Your staff has repeatedly stymied information requests from this committee, notably made by myself, the chairman, the ranking member, Senator Tillis, former Senator Pat Toomey, and others. In my experience, the Fed is a black hole. It consumes information, but it never releases it. Your fellow governors have personally misled me on at least 2 occasions with respect to Wyoming and digital assets. And in recent federal court filings, former Senator Pat Toomey has accused your staff of lying to him while providing technical assistance on legislation that passed in the National Defense Authorization Act in 2022. Now, I have behind me a statement by the Fed's General Counsel, one of the staff that's sitting behind you today, who said, quote, the Fed generally resists legislative prescriptions. Now, to me, that's thumbing his nose at Congress, the very people that you and I just agreed you are responsible to and the people depend on. So this is why the American people think there's a deep state. This is why they think there are faceless bureaucrats making policy to hurt the very people of this country. Just look at the mess the Fed made of Silicon Valley Bank. And I contend that there is a lack of understanding that is deliberate on the part of the Fed with respect to digital asset policy. So the Constitution says Congress is your boss, but somehow your staff have not gotten that message. So, Chairman Powell, do you commit on behalf of yourself and the Federal Reserve staff to comply fully with all document demands issued by this committee in a timely manner.
Sure.
Will you instruct your staff to be complete in their responses and not to obstruct the oversight functions of this committee?
You know, we always work with the committee to be responsive to your requests. Sometimes they're beyond our capacity to respond to, and we work with committee and with committee staff to do that, but we're always responsive to committee requests.
And I'll look forward to engaging with you when you feel that our requests are outside of the scope of the oversight that we have over the Fed. Do you commit to disciplining or removing any staff that are found to have engaged in debanking activity, furthering Operation Choke Point 2.0, or other misconduct?
I can't make an open-ended commitment to remove anybody, but I will tell you that I am struck, and my colleagues and I are struck by the growing number of cases of what appears to be debanking, and we're determined to take a fresh look at that. In fact, I took the thing that you showed during the debanking hearing. When I saw that, we're now taking that out of the manual. So I thank you for that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time's up.
Senator Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member, and thank you, Chair Powell, for being with us today. I appreciate your presence here. I'd like to start with the issue of the rising cost of home ownership, something that I know is of great interest to many of my colleagues on this committee. I know, Mr. Chair, that you care a lot about home ownership and making home ownership accessible and available to folks. My colleague, Senator Lummis, as well, many of the folks on my side of the aisle as well. And so I think this is something that we can agree on, that the rising cost of home ownership is a big challenge for our constituents, for Americans. And one of the big pressures, there are many, but one of the big pressures is the rising cost of home insurance. In Minnesota, families, seniors are struggling to manage a nearly 40% increase in home insurance rates. We've seen this over the last 7 years or so. And I know, Chair Powell, that you've told this committee in the past that rising cost of buying insurance for your home has been a source of inflation as we've been trying to manage inflation. Now, I don't know anyone who doesn't see this crisis of rising insurance rates as being caused by extreme weather events. We've seen massive flooding in southeastern United States. We've seen flooding in Minnesota. We've seen fires in the Mountain West in California.
Somebody gotta do it.
These are climate-related events. That's not a political position. That is just a fact. So, we've got banks that of course, require, understandably, that a homeowner provide insurance as a predicate for getting a mortgage. So there's a big question about what's going to happen when insurance becomes unaffordable, or in some parts of the country, just literally not available, and what impact that would have on the mortgage markets, on the value of American homes. Just last week, a new analysis from First Street showed that overall, the value of U.S. real estate could be reduced by $1.4 trillion, colleagues, over the next 30 years due to unaccounted for climate risk. That's the cost, the risk of not being able to afford home insurance because of these extreme weather events. And the prospect of trillions of dollars of property become uninsurable is clearly a recipe, it seems to me, for market instability in the rental as well as the mortgage market. So my question, Chair Powell, is given these trends, how do you think the Fed and how do you think we should be thinking about the challenges that these events are going to pose to insurance markets and to the overall financial stability of the economy? I'm asking you to comment specifically on climate change because I understand my colleagues on the other side of the aisle see that as a political question. It's more like what you see as the risk to financial stability here.
So let me quickly note that we don't regulate or supervise insurance companies for the most part, but we're seeing the same thing, which is both banks and insurance companies are pulling out of areas, coastal areas and things like that, or areas where there are a lot of fires. So what that is going to mean is that, if you fast forward 10 or 15 years, there are going to be regions of the country where you can't get a mortgage. mortgage, there won't be ATMs, there won't, the banks won't have branches and things like that. That's a possibility coming up down the road. It's not that the banks will stay there and keep making loans in the face of evidence of a disaster, or that insurance companies will do right policies. They can cancel those policies every year.
Right.
So I think the risk is that they just won't be there, and that people won't be able to get them. That's probably the issue.
And it seems that that would be a massive source of instability in our economy overall if you were to see that kind of dramatic decline in home ownership, home values, not to mention the disruption that would occur if people literally couldn't be in their homes anymore.
So I think it's going to fall, if that happens, it'll fall on homeowners and
Right.
residents, but it'll also fall on state and local governments, which you see happening now, where they're stepping in states where insurance is going away, private insurance. You're seeing states step in because they want those areas to remain prosperous. So I don't know that it's a financial stability issue, but it certainly will have significant economic consequences.
Well, certainly to try to figure out how to provide reinsurance as an example in the places where commercial insurance isn't available would be a massive impact on state budgets, if to follow your chain of thinking. And I know in this committee I've heard some of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle talk about the challenge overall with flood insurance, just as an example, and the massive expense that would have for us as well. I raise this, colleagues, because I think that this is an important issue that we need to be paying attention to. I do think it has a fundamental impact on the overall health of our economy as we look not even down the road, but where we are right now. So I'm out of time. Thank you, Chair Powell. I have a question. You and I have talked quite frequently about my deep and keen interest in the Community Reinvestment Act, and I'll follow up with a question on that for the record.
Thank you, Senator Smith. Senator Haggerty?
Thank you, Chairman Scott. Chairman Powell, it's good to see you here today. Welcome. I want to start by talking to you a bit about markets and inflation. Less than 6 months ago, you expressed some serious concerns about labor market weakness and the risk of persistent inflation. But since then, the FOMC has begun its easing cycle and cut its target rate by 100 basis points, as you mentioned in your opening remarks. Now in the January meeting, the FOMC has telegraphed that it felt both the labor market and inflation have reached a point where you're comfortable maintaining its target range. And my question is this: the recent market data, including last week's strong jobs report, indicate that the economy is on firm ground. Indeed, swaps markets have begun to price in fewer and fewer cuts this year. And I just wanted to talk broadly about these market conditions that you see. Do you see evidence of a higher neutral rate emerging at this point?
Yes, I mean, let me say there was a lot of reason to be concerned about downside risk in the labor market toward the middle of this year, but really that concern has diminished significantly. The labor market's very strong. I think the evidence is, my own view, and there are many different views on this, but is that the neutral rate will have risen meaningfully, very hard to be precise about it, from what it was. It was clearly very, very low before the pandemic. Extraordinarily low, historically so, but yes, I think it's moved up, and many of my colleagues on the FOMC feel that way too.
It sort of seems that way. I'd like to turn now to what seems to be a very popular topic right at this point, and that's the CFPB. In your response to Senator Britt's question earlier, you confirmed that when the CFPB submits quarterly funding requests, the Fed is not in a position to exercise any discretion over what the funds are used for. Is that correct?
As long as it's compliant with the law.
It just strikes me that the Fed is not in a position to hold the CFPB accountable for what it does or how it spends its money. Congress hasn't been allowed to hold the CFPB accountable for what it does or how it spends its money. It looks like no one has been able to hold the CFPB accountable at all. And now I hear, complaints coming from every corner, particularly from the other side, complaints about the excessive delegation of authority to a Republican CFPB director when this entity was intentionally created to be wholly unresponsive to elected officials. So I just find that quite rich. Before I close, I'd like to come to a point on climate, and particularly the Fed's forays into climate activism that have taken place over these past 4 years and the recent retrenchment that we've seen. It's one thing for the Fed to disassociate from its past climate activism in a press release, but to credibly claim that it's divorced itself from partisan climate policies, the Fed needs to do more than just issue statements. It needs to actually end its climate policies. The Fed's independence from politics is a headline topic at the moment, of course, and while much attention has been given to potential external pressures on the Fed, I think it's also critical that we scrutinize how the Fed's own regulation and supervision might be utilized to in some way politicize the institution. So when the central bank strays from its mandate by embracing partisan climate policies, the Fed embroils itself in controversial political debates and invites legitimate political scrutiny. So I just want to urge the Fed to refocus entirely on its core statutory mandates. I know it's a commitment that both you and I share, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here with us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Senator Warnock.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Got it. Welcome again, Chairman Powell. I want to echo the words of Ranking Member Warren and so many of my colleagues today on DOGE and Project 2025's illegal attack on the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Certainly the Bureau was not created to be dismantled. And since its inception, the CFPB has been the only federal agency solely dedicated to protecting Americans' wallets and pocketbooks from scammers and predatory companies in financial services. The CFPB reduced costs for Americans, returning more than $21 billion to Americans who have been cheated since its inception. I want us to focus on that as folks are talking about chasing after waste and fraud and abuse. The CFPB has returned more than $21 billion to Americans. Make no mistake, this attack on the CFPB will increase costs for Americans, and it will give the green light to fraudsters and predatory actors seeking to cheat hardworking Americans. And so, Chairman Powell, thousands of Georgians of all political stripes have written into my office, and they are alarmed by an unelected billionaire and his hacksters' dangerous attempts to access Americans' private data and the Treasury Department's systems that control $6 trillion in annual payments to millions of American citizens, including Social Security, Medicare, and tax refunds. Quickly, yes or no, has Elon Musk or members of his team, to your knowledge, attempted to access the Fed's protected data and systems? Yes or no?
I don't believe so. I don't believe so.
Okay, so will you commit to report to this committee, majority and minority, immediately should you become aware of any such attempt by Elon Musk or Doge to pierce the Fed's independence or to access its protected systems?
Yep.
Thank you for that commitment. The Fed's latest monetary policy report states that the tight labor market has allowed employment and earnings gaps between Black and Hispanic Americans and white Americans to narrow. I was glad to see that many of the long-standing disparities in employment and wages by sex, race, ethnicity, and education have narrowed under the Biden administration. Some gaps have reached historic lows. Specifically, the employment gap for Black workers and white workers is near its lowest point in almost 50 years. That is the economy that the Trump administration is inheriting, a historic low in almost 50 years. Chair Powell, as you work to promote maximum employment, what steps will the Fed take to ensure that these equity gains are permanent?
So the best thing we can do is it's both of our mandates really, because as you well know, high inflation hits people at the low end of the income spectrum first and most. And in addition to that, we know that the benefits of a strong labor market over time can be really visible and important as communities as well. So we pursue our mandate, we keep our heads down, and it works out that is the single best thing we can do to foster, closing those gaps.
You pursue your mandate, you want to make sure that it's working. Would you agree that we still need good equity data to continue to narrow and close those gaps by race and gender?
I do think, we're always going to be in favor of good data at the Fed, and we do have quite a bit of that data on our website. website.
But if we don't have equity data, it'd be difficult to know, right?
Yes.
I'm glad to hear you still believe in the value of good equity data for economic policy making. It's better to fly with the data than to fly blind. I'm not sure what's so controversial about the data. And while I was disappointed to hear that the Federal Reserve, which is independent from the White House, it scrubbed a diversity and inclusion section from its website after President Trump's executive order, while also scrubbing data on the racial, ethnic, and gender makeup of its economists and researchers, I hope you will continue to ensure that the public has good data on how our economy is working or not working for historically marginalized Americans. I also hope you will reconsider your decisions around the whitewashing of the Fed's website. Chair Powell, as we think about the value of protecting data on the black-white wealth gap or employment gap, I think it's important to understand what policymakers can learn from this data. Historically, from what you've seen in the data, historically, what types of economic events have caused the black-white wealth gap or employment gap to widen?
Well, high inflation, downturns, you see generally, just take the black unemployment rate, it generally moves at twice the speed of the white unemployment rate. So when it goes up faster. When it comes down faster. But at the end of the day, there's always been a gap, and we want to run a strong labor market, and we target overall labor market conditions for maximum employment. But one of the benefits of that is that gap comes down.
Thank you so much. We all know that fully deregulating our financial regulators like the CFPB, firing bank examiners at the FDIC, or weakening the Fed's supervisory capacity makes an economic shock or recession more likely. We know that this disproportionately impacts Black and Hispanic workers, and there are real consequences to weakening and eliminating financial regulations that keep us safe. Working people are the ones especially who suffer. So thank you so much, and I look forward to continuing to work with you to close these gaps.
Senator Bates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chair Powell, thank you for presenting your report to the committee today and for coming to meet with me last week in my office as well. The Federal Reserve has enormous power over Americans' ability to work and earn a living, and the Fed's interest rate decisions have an especially big impact on industries like manufacturing, which depend on big investments. Chair Powell, the Fed's data on manufacturing is still holding up nationally, but it doesn't look very good in the Chicago region, which includes most of my state in Indiana. The Beige Book says manufacturing jobs are declining and fewer people are buying manufactured products. It also says that steel demand is at a low level, auto production has slowed, and machinery orders are down. What does that say about the rest of the country? When manufacturing in the heartland slows, does that signal trouble for industries in other parts of the country?
It can. It doesn't always, but it certainly can. We watch the manufacturing sector. It's very important. Manufacturing jobs tend to be high productivity jobs. They're very important in our economy. But I would say over the last couple of years, manufacturing was pretty weak during years in which we had high GDP overall. Manufacturing is a smaller proportion of the economy than it used to be. It's still extremely important.
Senator Reid asked you why free trade doesn't work when one of the giant players doesn't abide by the rules. The China shock is proof of that. The Fed has a mandate to maximize employment. How do you account for the whole industry that is repeatedly suffocated by unfair competition?
We don't do trade policy. We're not responsible for it. We don't comment on those who do trade policy. So we don't really have a role in focusing specifically on that. That really is left to those who have responsibility over trade.
Do you agree that a healthy manufacturing economy is important to a healthy overall U.S. economy, though?
I do.
I hope you had an opportunity to read Robert Lighthizer February 6th essay in the New York Times. He explains why a big trade imbalance between any two countries is harmful to citizens in both of those countries. How does the Fed take the trade deficit into account in your decision-making at all?
Again, we really don't. We're aware of it, but it's not something that directly affects our mandate goals.
So not at all?
No. I did read his book, by the way. I didn't read that editorial.
Fair enough. It is a good book as well. I want to get into tariffs. It's no secret that most conventional economists hate tariffs. But I want to note that Indiana gained manufacturing jobs during President Trump's first term with the 2018-2019 tariffs. Even though the economist's conventional wisdom is that tariffs will reduce jobs, do you commit to following the data and not prejudge any outcome?
Very much so, as we did in 2018-19.
Finally, my staff reviewed the research paper on tariffs in preparation for this hearing. And I want to point out one of them called The Employment Consequences of U.S. Trade Wars. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter this paper for the record. It found that the timing of tariffs are very important. It found that China's retaliation of President Trump's tariffs did hurt U.S. jobs, but if the U.S. had imposed tariffs on China much earlier in the 90s and early 2000s, it would have almost completely eliminated job losses due to the China shock. And I know you've said what you said before, but will you and your staff please take a look at this paper?
We certainly will. I imagine we already have, but I'd love to see it.
I appreciate that. Home ownership is an essential part of the American dream, but families are struggling to afford homes. In just 5 years, the price of a typical home in Indiana has gone up more than 60%. More than 3/4 of American families can't afford an average home in their neighborhood. How do the Fed decisions about monetary policy affect the ability of regular families to buy a home?
Most of what will have driven that increase will be about some of it's about local regulation, as you I'm sure know. It's also about just wages going up and costs of materials and things like that going up. And land costs and all that are going up a lot. The channel that through which we affect housing is, of course, interest rates. And right now, interest rates are still pretty high, but actually, mortgage rates are really not set at the Fed. Those are really key off of longer run things. Nonetheless, we're clearly having an effect on the housing market, and that'll unwind as we normalize policy. But we're still going to be faced with high insurance costs and high material costs and labor shortages and all the things that keep driving housing prices up across the country.
Thank you. My time has expired.
Next will be Senator Gallego.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Powell, just kind of running along that vein of thought, the housing costs are one of the top concerns of my constituents in Arizona. From 2010 to 2022, rents in Arizona increased by 72%, and I wish wages were as increased to match, but they do not. And the average 30-year fixed mortgage rate has been about 6% for nearly 30 months. With very few rate cuts anticipated in the near future, potential cost increases from tariffs or imported construction materials, as well as the demand that we're going to see in terms of rebuilding from California and labor shortages, what do you think needs to happen to make housing more affordable in Arizona and the United States in general?
You know, housing policy and things to help housing supply are really in your wheelhouse, not ours. I do think you know, the housing markets around the country are still suffering from the after effects of the pandemic. Once that's all the way through and short-term rates are down to normal, whatever the new normal level is, I think housing costs are still going to be high. I think it's still going to be expensive to build housing in many parts of the country where lots of the urban areas, the obvious places to build housing has happened. So I think it's a long-term. There's a short-term problem which will go away in coming years, but there's a longer-term problem with housing availability, and that's going to be something that's not within our authorities or power to affect.
You know, one of the things that I've seen in Arizona is because we have people that are locked into mortgages at 2.9, 2.8%, and in order for them to move to the new house, they're going to have to essentially go and try to get quote unquote a bigger house. The mortgage payments is going to be through the roof. And while I know the Fed doesn't set the mortgage rate, at the same time, one of the biggest drivers, obviously, of inflation, especially in places like Arizona, is housing costs. And then one of the biggest decisions that essentially you make on whether or not to move rates is inflation, which is driven by housing costs. So we're in this kind of perpetual vicious circle in Arizona when it comes to interest rates. So I don't know what the answer to that is, but I just wanted to at least for there to be some understanding on that, because it's the reason we're not breaking out of this cycle is because the problem kind of feeds itself over and over and over again.
yes, that's exactly what's going on. But it's not obvious, though, that lower rates would lead to lower housing inflation, because, of course, that would increase housing demand. It would unlock people's, low mortgages, but that creates both a buyer and a seller. So it's not clear that would be something that would drive down housing inflation.
Well, my supposition, especially in places like Arizona, which is really growing fast, is that by increasing supply with lower rates, you end up essentially having more of a competitive market. So people will start moving and essentially bring down the overall cost. But moving on, so I've also heard from businesses in Arizona, they're concerned about the threat of economic stability in tariffs that are imposed on our key U.S. trade partners. How should we expect prices to move for basic items like tomatoes, peppers, cars, and the like if we place a 25% tariff on Mexico next month, as the president has threatened?
Well, as you know, we don't do tariff policy, and we don't do commentary on tariff policy. I just generally, when somebody's got to pay the tariff, and it could be the exporter, it can be the importer, it can be a middleman, and
somebody
can be
pays for it, though.
Somebody does, but in some cases it doesn't reach the consumer much. In some cases it does, and it really does depend on facts that we haven't seen yet.
But that also contributes to some of the calculations on inflation overall.
It can, but
it's hard to be.
Also, there's a question of how persistent that would be and how large it would be.
So, and of course, I understand you're not here to specifically comment on trade policy, but overall, is it your opinion, let's just say a basic opinion, that high tariffs can lead to higher costs, which would then end up being seen in terms of your inflation calculation that helps you set the rates?
I'd say that's a possible outcome, which will depend very much on specific facts about what's being tariffed, for how long, et cetera.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Senator McCormick.
Thank you, Chairman Scott, and Chairman Powell, good to see you again. In the past 5 years alone, the national debt has exploded. Federal spending and the debt have increased by more than 50%. Debt held by the public, or true debt obligation, has more than tripled during the past 15 years, reaching more than $28 trillion. All told, U.S. national debt is now over 120% of our GDP. And runaway spending contributed to a regressive tax on Americans, tax known as inflation. In the past 5 years, the cost of living has skyrocketed for working-class Pennsylvanians, especially, as you and I discussed when we visited, those relying on fixed incomes. And unfortunately, that compounded effect of inflation has not been offset by commensurate rise in wages for many Pennsylvanians. I've heard from countless Pennsylvanians who had to count their dollars at the gas pump, cancel family trips, even tighten their belts at the dinner table because of inflation. So while we discuss these heady issues, let's not lose sight of the very real human cost of the decisions made by people sitting in this room. And given that cost, I'd like to ask you about the national debt and the cost of financing it. We now spend more to service the debt annually than we do on national defense. So how concerned are you about the accelerating pace of government borrowing and the borrowing cost, which will affect families in the form of higher mortgage rates?
Yeah, we don't comment on fiscal policy other than to say that, as my predecessors have said, that the U.S. federal budget is on an unsustainable path. It's not that the level of spending or the level of the debt itself is unsustainable. It's that the path is unsustainable, and ultimately the level of the debt will be. So there's no time like the present to start working on this. The longer we wait, the more painful it will be. It's something we need to do and will have to do in the long run, and the short run is better than the long run for that.
And just as a practical matter, how do you factor that into your policy thinking and decisions?
We don't. We're here to achieve maximum employment and price stability, and it's really up to Congress to deal with fiscal issues, and we leave that to you.
Well, just as a more practical question, I think, which falls clearly in your bailiwick, because of that national debt, it's caused the supply of U.S. Treasuries needed to finance the debt to skyrocket. And that's at the same time the Fed is shrinking its holdings of Treasury through quantitative tightening. So the question is, or could you at least give us some insight into the impact that this is having on the Treasury market as investors must absorb that supply? And in particular, I'm interested in how the biggest holders of U.S. Treasuries, how their behavior is changing as debt increases.
So this is a real Treasury question, but I think from our standpoint, I can say that there are lots of buyers for Treasuries, but Treasury buyers are going to be factoring in their assessments of the supply that's coming, and that may be part of the reason why the term premium has increased, as you know, over the course of this year. Although the rates have been going up and down lately, they're almost back to where they were before the election.
I know the Fed has been moving forward with comprehensive changes to the stress test process. Could you discuss how you're thinking about reducing the volatility of the results and increasing transparency on the stress test?
So on transparency, we're going to release the models, clean them up and publish the models, put them out for comment. In terms of volatility, we're also going to release the stress test scenarios before we implement them. In terms of volatility, what we said we would do is average the changes to, the problem is the stress capital buffer can be moving up and down just because of volatility in the results, and it seemed like a good idea to smooth that out by averaging over a couple of years. We're putting all this out for comment though, and ultimately we'll reflect those comments in the final decision.
Thank you. I'll yield back my time.
Thank you, Senator McCormick. Senator Blunt Rochester.
Thank you, Chair and Ranking Member, and thank you, Chairman Powell. It's good to see you, and thank you for meeting with me last week. We discussed everything from jobs and housing supply to the real impact on Fed policies on all of our lives. And I also got a chance to share with you just the concerns and consternation of Delawareans who, for the past few weeks, have been frightened by hirings and funding freezes, and just the real impact on people's financial and personal data and information when DOGE has access to this information. I'm hearing from my constituents as well about the potential shuttering of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. As Senator Warnock mentioned, CFPB has returned over $21 billion to millions of consumers, and that's a real impact. But I want to also highlight that it was your leadership in the Fed working with Congress and the Biden administration to really help answer that question that you were asked about if you had the choice to switch countries with France and Germany and others, that you said no, you'd rather be here. And that success is a testament to all of us. We came together during a really tough economic time at the end of this, during a pandemic, and it limited the recession and job losses. And since COVID, we've seen a robust job growth. But we also have grappled with inflation that drove prices up for so many goods. And I've worked to address one part of this phenomenon, our supply chain disruptions. In fact, I recently joined Senators Cantwell and Blackburn to reintroduce the bipartisan Promoting Resilient Supply Chains Act to address supply chain vulnerabilities. And while we see indications that inflation may be slowing, too many of our constituents are still facing high prices and economic uncertainty. We need to do everything that we can to address this anxiety and the realities that Americans are facing. And there seems to be a disconnect. While the economy is doing, well here, on the ground, people aren't really feeling that. So, Mr. Powell, can you talk about, from your perspective, just what is driving this disconnect between traditional economic indicators, such as GDP growth and the stock market performance, and the tangible benefits for families?
I'd be glad to. So it is clear that the overall aggregate numbers are just very, very good for the economy. 4% unemployment, inflation down to 2.6% last year, and the economy well in excess of 2%. These are good numbers. But what people are feeling is the results of several years of inflation, and particularly for people in the in the low and moderate income category, they're really feeling it. So if you look at the earnings releases and press conferences that they do, that companies like the dollar stores and things like that do, who deal a lot with low and moderate income people, they're all telling you that those consumers are feeling really strapped. So we do understand that, and we try to keep that in mind, even though we acknowledge that the overall data are good. We see what people are feeling, and that's inflation. So it's just another reminder how much people hate inflation and how bad inflation is for people, high inflation, and it just furthers our resolve to get inflation back to 2% and keep it there.
Thank you. One of the big areas that I focus on, you've heard many of us across the aisle talk about the housing crisis that we have in this country. And I know a few others have asked questions previous to me about this, but I would love to follow up afterwards with specifically what you think are the short-term and long-term things that we can do to really address the housing supply and affordability crisis. I have legislation that looks at things like reducing regulatory barriers, zoning reform, these things that we know we can, in partnership with local governments, make a significant difference. And so if I could, would love, again, to follow up with you, even cutting red tape, those kinds of things that we can do long-term and short-term. But I did want to mention one last thing in the 20 seconds that I have. The Fed listens, things that you do, activities that you do. Could you talk a little bit about that as well? Because working people, a lot of times people don't feel that they have a place in these kind of conversations. But can you talk about what the Fed does with Fed Listens?
So briefly, we did this as part of our review 5 years ago. We do it on an ongoing basis now. And the idea is that we break out from the usual people that we talk to, which is a pretty diverse group, and try to deal directly with people who are experiencing the economy and our policies. And it's been quite eye-opening to listen to people talk about it. We had one person at the Chicago conference 5 years ago who said the expansion, which was then 9 years old, is just reaching my community. And he talked for some minutes about how companies were going into prisons and finding people who weren't going to get out for a year or two and training them, stuff like that. It was get your pin drop. It was very telling stuff. So I think we learned from all that, and so we'll keep doing it.
Well, I will end by saying there's a famous quote, I think it's Martin Luther King, we may have come over on different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. We need to get it together. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Blunt Rochester. Senator Marino.
Chairman, thank you for being here. Thank you for taking the time on the phone the other day. Appreciate that very much. Just to ask you a broad general question. When you increase M2, the money supply, by 40% over a short period of time, is that going to drive inflation?
It could. Well, as I think we discussed, monetary aggregates have not been a great predictor of really any other thing. But I think when there's a sharp increase like that in M2, then that could, that's something that might cause some inflation.
Now, is that just to be clear for the people watching, that happened because of public policy in this institution, correct? Now, there wasn't a civilian-led effort to increase government spending outside of the elected leaders that chose to make those decisions.
I think that was part of it. I think there were just a lot of causes in the inflation that we saw, but that it's fiscal policy, it was monetary policy, it was just closing and reopening the economy, just generated a bunch of confusing signals, and now a lot of inflation everywhere in the world, really, whether people did a lot of fiscal policy or not. So there were many factors, and that's, I would say, one of them.
But just to be clear, it wasn't the citizens of the country making those decisions. Those were elected leaders choosing to close the economy. Businesses didn't decide one day to close, didn't decide to not be able to go to work. Those were decisions made by policymakers, correct?
Yes.
So it's a little disingenuous to be hear my colleagues talk about how they care so much about inflation when in reality they cause it. But I don't want to continue that. I'd ask you a question just out of curiosity, because you worked at the Department of Treasury. At what point did you think they were going to run out of ink? Did that concern you, that maybe it was possible that they were printing so much money that the Treasury would have to find alternate ink suppliers?
Didn't occur to me, but good question.
So along those lines, something that concerns me a lot is the idea that we would even look like China in any way. So can I have your commitment that as long as you're the chairman of the Federal Reserve System, that we will never have a central bank digital currency?
Yes.
Thank you for that. I think that's extremely important. It makes me very happy to hear you say that. Shifting gears to a little bit, something that matters to me and entrepreneurs all over the country is why can't I wire somebody money at 6 p.m. Eastern time? Can we get to a 24/7 scenario where wires are cleared every day, all day? I think that would be very, very helpful to businesses all over the country.
So that's coming. It's just coming slowly here. We have that at FedNow. We'll get in touch with you about FedNow. We provide that service between two banks, and others want to provide it too. But yes, we do kind of lag a lot of other countries in that, and it is time for that to happen.
So I know I don't want to put you on the spot, but to put you on the spot, it's FedNow is very familiar with it, but it was a little bit late in coming. Can we get a commitment to do that this year, so that by the end of this calendar year, businesses can transact 24/7 and settle payments?
I think they can do that now I believe they can do it now on FedNow, and they can also do it on the RTP system as well. So I think it's available. Let me check in and I'll follow up with you.
That'd be great. One other piece of the puzzle here is what do you think the Fed can do to fight international terror groups, for example, Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, the proxies that are funded by places like Qatar? Do you think that we're doing enough to keep them outside of the banking system? Because at the end of the day, terrorism is ultimately funded by these bad actors. I met with the hostage families this morning. It was heart-wrenching to hear stories about kids that are my kids' age being held for almost 500 days. The Qataris are obviously completely complicit in all this. What can we do? What advice would you have that we can do to make certain that we bring these terror groups to their knees?
You know, we do enforce the money laundering laws very, very strictly, and but it's a tough question. You know, it's a huge focus in international meetings and things like that. But you're right; it's really hard to nail it down, particularly if it's all happening overseas. But we can do what we can do with our banks. We don't want to make it so costly, though, that they debank people because they're so worried about violating the money laundering laws. I mean, that's some of what's happening, according to the banks, is that they're so afraid that there might be money laundering that they just cut people off at the first flag, as opposed to perfectly legal businesses are being, thrown out because of their fear of being caught doing money laundering. So I think there's a balance there, but no, it's a really, really hard project and one we spend a lot of time on.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Marino. The patient and persistent Senator Kim.
Thank you. I wanted to make sure some of my colleagues had a chance to be able to run off to some of their meetings, and I've enjoyed being able to listen to the chairman, to be able to hear some of your articulation here. I just want to share with you, I did a telephone town hall last night, and I'm glad to hear some of my other colleagues as well. And there is a lot of anxiety right now by the American people in trying to understand what's happening and seeing and interpreting what's happening on the news. I guess I just wanted to ask you, if you were, for your words of how you would explain to the American people the importance of independence when it comes to the Federal Reserve.
So I think the point is that we'll make better policy, we'll keep inflation lower if we just focus on doing our job and stay out of politics, stay out of elections, don't try to favor or to hurt any political party, any political figure, just focus on the data. If we start putting up political filters, we'll be no good, we'll be less effective at our already quite difficult job. And I do think that's broadly understood. I think there's broad support up here in both political parties and on both sides of the hill. I think that there is a decent degree of support for continued independence. That's not to say we shouldn't be accountable. We should be very accountable and transparent about what we do. We should be up here explaining what we do and why to our oversight body, which is this committee and then the same committee on the House side. So that's what I would say.
making decisions about your core mission about stability and about growth, but not thinking about it in terms of the context of an election cycle, for instance. Is that right?
Yes, exactly.
I wanted to just shift gears a little bit, but similar type topic. You know, there's been a lot of attention to the role of public servants within our government, and you know, our understanding what roles they play, how many to have. And I guess I just wanted to ask if you could speak to the role of the Federal Reserve employees, their qualifications, and more importantly, like their importance to the mission and being able to engage. How important are they to the work that you are trying to do towards stability and growth?
So I'm very proud to be associated with the people of the Federal Reserve, and I'll give you an example why. When the pandemic hit, kind of out of the blue, and economies all over the world are shutting down, the U.S. Treasury market is stopping to function, companies can't roll over their commercial paper, economists are writing about a depression, people at the Fed who went through the global financial crisis 10 years before step forward and say, we got this, we know what to do. Here's what we do with the Treasury market, what we do with money market funds, here's what we do with the companies that can't get any financing. The markets were closed and companies were having maturing debt that they had to roll over. The people who knew what to do in that pretty dire emergency were working at the Federal Reserve and other places, but I will tell you, it was impressive. And I think if you could have seen the way people react and you know how hard they work and how much they know and how well it worked, really. Our work during the acute phase of the crisis was very successful, and it's entirely due to the knowledge base that resides with career people at the Fed.
Yeah. Would you say that the Fed is overstaffed?
No, I would say that, overworked, maybe not overstaffed. Everybody at the Fed works really hard. It's a place where people work.
Now, a lot of this conversation right now about staffing numbers at different departments and agencies, it's going back to this sense of the taxpayer dollar, in terms of accountability there. But I guess I just wanted to ask you, is the Fed paid for by the taxpayer dollars? Can you explain to us what the burden is on the taxpayer?
So we're self-funding through our large balance sheet.
So when it comes to the staffing at the Federal Reserve, not coming from the taxpayers, is that right?
Indirectly, we give away all of our profits. We give back to Treasury, and those profits would be higher if we didn't pay for the Fed. So in fairness, it's ultimately paid for by the taxpayer. But in that sense, we're self-funded.
Self-funded. Yeah. Just one last question here. You talked about the different actors that are involved when it comes to levying tariffs in terms of paying that the exporter, the importer, the consumers, that middlemen could be part of that. I guess I just wanted to ask you, do you know of any way in which to 100% guarantee that the consumers will not have to pay higher costs when it comes to tariffs?
Not really. It's not going to be easy to identify with any accuracy exactly where costs do fall, but I think it'd be hard to guarantee any particular outcome. I think we're just going to have to see.
Great, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Wallen, did you?
I do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make a point before we quit here, and that is about law enforcement. If you keep the laws the same on the books, but you fire the cops, you're going to have a lot more crime. That's kind of law enforcement 101. And the problem we've got right now is law in the books about consumer protection hasn't changed. But the cops, at least right at this moment, have been told at CFPB to stand down. And I appreciate that we have state AGs who step in, and often they partner up with the CFPB. But there is no one else for the giant banks who actually does what's called the bank examination, the supervision. And that is so important. Remember the Wells Fargo scandal, where Wells Fargo was illegally opening fake accounts in people's names? You find that through bank examination, not because the person who got cheated could figure it out. Bank of America gets hauled in because bank examiners discovered they were charging people illegally on junk fees. Nobody finds that but the people who are down in the banks doing the bank examination on behalf of the consumers. Look, we tried a patchwork of law enforcement for consumers before 2008, We had all those laws scattered among 7 different agencies, and we saw how it ended. It ended with millions of people losing their homes, millions of people losing their jobs, millions of people losing their savings. The CFPB is our law enforcement agency to make sure that the giant banks follow the rules on consumer protection. And for me, right now, I'd be really worried about doing business with a giant bank when there's no cop on the beat.
Thank you, Senator. I'll recognize myself for just one question, and it'll even be relevant to your job, I promise, Mr. Chairman. So thank you for your patience and for being here. I wanted to follow up on there were some questions, or at least I know Senator Rounds asked a Basel III question, and your response was basically, let's get the people in place from the administration, and then we'll proceed again. Treasury Secretary Besson recently said that the banking system is, I believe, quote, well capitalized, perhaps over capitalized, unquote. And given that assessment, or if you agree with it, could you discuss the necessity of advancing a new Basel III proposal, specifically how an updated regulation would impact the ability of the regional banks to compete with the big Wall Street banks, and what consideration should be taken into account to ensure that we have a competitive banking system? Because I know there's this concern comes and goes, and for those of us who have largely regional banks, or God love them, the best of all, community banks and credit unions, a competitive system is really important. So if you could just answer that, and then I'll wrap up.
Sure. So we're eager to get together with new colleagues from the FDIC, new leadership of the FDIC and the OCC, to try to finish Basel III. My own has been that our banks are well capitalized, and Basel III was not supposed to be an exercise in raising capital in U.S. banks. Mario Draghi said that. Dan Tarullo said that back in the day, I believe. So I think that's about right. We have some work to do, but we'll get there, I believe, fairly quickly. In terms of your regionals, they don't face the GSIB surcharges. They don't face quite the burden that the large banks face on resolution planning and that sort of thing. So we certainly need those banks to be healthy and profitable, because we need them to compete with the GSIBs. We don't want a world where the GSIBs just keep getting a bigger and bigger share of the economy. That's not what we're looking for, and that's what a lot of pressure. We've seen the number of community banks, especially, declining for 30 years, and this is not something we want to. We don't want to be the cause of that. If it's happening by natural causes or because of evolving technology, that's one thing. But we don't want to be inadvertently causing that to happen.
So as you look at a Basel III exercise, can you think of anything specifically that ensures that competitive, diverse banking system is maintained rather than a consolidation, whether it's fewer community banks into more regional banks, or fewer regional banks into more Wall Street banks?
Well, I just think you think twice before you impose the kinds of things that we impose on the largest banks and the next to largest banks. You want to be careful not to just think we should do exactly the same thing. It's what tends to happen is, so for smaller banks, it raises the fixed costs, is what it does, of banking, and it makes it harder to start new banks, and makes it harder for any but the largest to be successful. So that's not what we want. We want a lot of competition, and these regionals, it's important that they thrive.
I agree, and I agree with your assessment. So thank you for that. Thank you for staying with us for the day, and glad we could get you first. So as we wrap up, for senators who wish to submit questions for the hearing record, those questions are due 1 week from today, Tuesday, February 18th. Chair Powell, you have 45 days from that day to submit your response to questions for the record. Thank you. The committee stands adjourned.
Thank you.